education specialist at UNICEF's Regional Office for Eastern and Southern Africa. And happy to welcome you to our learning event today on two key findings from two Mixed Eagle reports. Most of you are probably familiar with MIX and maybe with Mixed Eagle, but just a quick background. MIX stands for Multiple Indicator Cluster Surveys, and they are nationally representative household surveys that generate key data on children and women. They've been implemented for many, many years, I think 27 across 118 countries, over 349 surveys. And they're really the largest source of statistically sound and internationally comparable data on women and children. So that makes them very powerful. The Mixed Eagle initiative started in, I think, 2018, and it stands for Education Analysis for Global Learning and Equity. And it was launched to really identify, to address two key problems, sort of gaps in education indicators and data that we have available, and also a lack of effective utilization of that data. And so the initiative focuses on two main activities. One is on building national capacity to leverage mixed education data, to analyze it, to understand it and use it. And secondly, to generate sort of global and national and regional evidence from the mixed education data. And these two reports that we'll be discussing today are the result of that type of analysis at a sort of regional level. The two reports, the first is Are Children Really Learning? And Peggy Kelly from a statistics and monitoring specialist at UNICEF will be presenting those key findings for about 15 minutes. Then we'll move to the second report, which is In Pursuit of Education for All. And Peggy's colleague Sakshi Mishra will be presenting those key findings. Then we'll have about 15 minutes for Q&A and discussion and a brief closing. So that's our agenda. And with that, I'll hand over to Peggy to start off with our first presentation.
Okay, thank you. So I'm just going to share my screen. Okay, I trust you all can see the presentation. So as Annika mentioned, I'm going to be presenting the key findings from a recent report that we did called Are Children Really Learning? Exploring Foundational Skills in the Midst of a Learning Crisis. So the basic outline for the presentation, I'll just give a brief introduction. And then I'll go into the findings on foundational learning and equity in developing countries. And I'm going to focus, or at least highlight, the experiences of the KIX Africa 19 countries. We'll be looking, first of all, at the overall foundational learning levels, and then going into disaggregations to look more specifically at differences in learning by wealth, disability, child labor, and gender. And then I'll be finishing with looking at a foundational learning analysis as it relates to COVID-19, comparing both children who are in school and out of school to give you an idea of what's happened because of the school closures. And then also a simulation that we did of teaching at the right level. Okay, so to begin, I think many of you have heard the expression that education is the great equalizer. Well, now, as we are in our third year of the COVID pandemic, education actually is at risk of becoming the great divider. There are still 405 million school children in 23 countries that continue to be affected by full or partial school closures. And over the past 2 years, about 147 million children missed at least half of their in-person learning. And this amounts to about 2 trillion hours of lost in-person instruction over the past 2 years. And then even as schools have reopened, in some cases, children are not returning to school. So looking specifically at this report, So we use the mix data that Annika mentioned. We used the sixth round of the survey, and we analyzed the data from 32 countries and territories. They were all low and middle income countries. And of these, of the 32 countries and territories, 5 are KIX Africa 19 countries and 7 are KIX Africa 21 countries. And we covered a wide range of topics, including gender. We looked at differences by wealth quintile, child labor, disability, learning progression as children progress from grade 1 through grade 9, children who are both in school and out of school, whether children have internet access, differences by language. We also looked at learning loss estimates due to the pandemic, and then COVID learning loss and recovery. So I won't be touching on all of these topics in the presentation, but I will try to cover as many as possible. Okay, so to begin, foundational learning skills, they target children who have completed grade 2. So it's really based on grade 2 textbooks. So in our analysis, we looked at children who are attending grade 3. So they've already completed grade 2 and are attending grade 3. And these are children who should have foundational learning skills. So when we look first at foundational reading skills, we found that only 30%, this is overall out of all 32 countries and territories, that only 30% of the children who are attending grade 3 actually had foundational reading skills. But now I've highlighted in the red bar the 5 KIX Africa 19 countries, and you can see that all of them are below the median. So, I mean, in the case of Ghana, for example, only 7% of children that are in grade 3 have the foundational reading skills that they should have had at that level.
Area of getting the letters to the Africa 19 sponsor.
Oh, I'm sorry, it was, oh, okay. I thought I heard a question. Yeah, so, and then also in yellow are all the countries in sub-Saharan Africa. And you can see that there are 12 altogether that we included in our analysis. And all 12 of these countries have foundational reading skills levels below the median. So they're all below 30%. Now moving on to foundational numeracy skills, we found that only 18% of children attending grade 3 had foundational numeracy skills. And again, when we look at the countries in the KIX 19, we see that all of them are below the median, and some are quite low, like Lesotho, only 2% of children attending grade 3 have foundational numeracy skills. You know, the Gambia, 6%. So in fact, all 5 of the countries, in all 5 of the countries in KIX 19, fewer than 10% of children have foundational numeracy skills who are attending grade 3. Now, if we look more specifically at equity, we find that that children are less likely to have foundational learning skills if they come from low-income families, if they have a less supportive home environment, if they have functional difficulties or disabilities, or if they're involved in child labor. But we also found that girls tend to outperform boys, at least when it comes to reading. So let's look at this a little bit more carefully. So when we look at the gaps in reading skills between children who come from the poorest households versus children who come from the richest households in each country, we see quite a gap. In Zimbabwe, for example, only 12% of children from the lowest wealth quintile have foundational reading skills, and that compares to 61% of children from the wealthiest households. So we see, you know, that there is quite a difference in the attainment of foundational skills by wealth. So children who come from wealthier households are at a significant advantage. And overall, for all the countries, the gap was 22 percentage points between the lowest income and the highest income. But we see, the gaps are even larger in countries like Lesotho and Zimbabwe. Now, when we look at children with disabilities, so Sakshi will be going into much more detail in her presentation about children with disabilities, but looking specifically at the foundational reading skills, we see that children without any functional difficulties, 43% had foundational reading skills, but only 35% of those with functional difficulties had foundational reading skills. And similarly, there's a gap for foundational numeracy skills, where 28% without functional difficulties had foundational numeracy skills. And this compares to just 22% of those who have functional difficulties or disabilities. And then we also looked at foundational skills for children comparing children who are in school and not involved in child labor with children who are not in school and involved in child labor. And in this chart, we break down the experiences of all the countries that we looked at. And I highlighted the experiences of the KIX Africa 19 countries. So when we look at, for example, the Gambia, Ghana, and Sierra Leone, the blue line represents children who are in child labor and not attending school. And you see it's a flat line. So basically these children are not learning. They have no foundational reading skills. They're not learning at all. And then compare that to the red line, which is children who are in school and not in child labor. And even though in those countries, the learning rates are still low, they're definitely higher than for children who are in child labor. And then when we look at Zimbabwe and Lesotho, we see that children who are attending school and not in child labor have at least twice the rate of foundational reading skills as children who are not in school and in child labor. So the message is clear that children need to be in school. They shouldn't be involved in child labor so that they have the opportunity to learn. This is actually one of my favorite charts because I find it very interesting. On the left is foundational reading skills, the gender gap, and on the right is foundational numeracy skills. So we see that for almost all of the countries we analyzed, girls have an advantage when it comes to reading. So a greater share of girls in almost every country, with the exclusion of Sierra Leone is one, but in almost all the other countries, girls have an advantage when it comes to reading. And then when we look at numeracy, we see that the experiences are a little bit more mixed. But even so, there are more countries where girls have an advantage, even in numeracy, than boys. Although when we look specifically at the African 19 countries, we see that, for example, Sierra Leone and Ghana, the gap is in favor of boys when it comes to foundational numeracy. So moving on to the second part of the presentation, where I look at foundational learning skills related to COVID. So we had seen for years that the out of school rate had been declining. But in the last couple of years, from 2018 to 2020, the number of out of school children from primary to upper secondary school actually increased by 5.9 million. And that was the first time that we saw a decrease in the total number, that the decreasing trend in the total number of out of school children was reversed for as far back as we can observe the historical data. So we're really seeing a big change here in the number of out of school children. So when we looked in our analysis, unfortunately, the mixed data were all pre-COVID. The data were collected prior to 2020 in our sample. But to get an idea of what the impact of a year of school closures would be, we compared the foundational learning skills of children who are in school versus children who are out of school. And we found, not surprisingly, that children who are out of school have much lower rates of foundational learning skills. So for example, in reading, on average, 46% of children who are in school had foundational reading skills versus only 12% of children who are out of school. And, just looking at, some of the examples I highlighted for the KIX Africa 19, in Sierra Leone, virtually 0.1%, so almost no out of school children had foundational reading skills, but 24% of those who are in school do. So we see, quite large gaps. Also the Gambia, similarly, 1% of those who are out of school have foundational reading skills compared to 18% of those in school. So obviously children need to be in school if they're going to have the opportunity to learn. So this was another kind of interesting analysis that we did. So we said, how long would it take at the current pace of learning? As I mentioned in one of the first slides, at grade 3, only a very small share, 30% on average had foundational reading skills, 18% had foundational numeracy skills. So at the current pace of learning, how long would it take for at least 70% of the children to have either foundational numeracy or foundational reading skills? So in this chart, I'm looking at foundational numeracy skills. And although primary school on average is about 6 years, we find that it could take much longer. I mean, in the case of Lesotho, at the current pace of learning, it could take 17 years of primary school before at least 70% of children would have foundational numeracy skills. And then even in certain other countries, as you see, it's even greater. So the pace of learning is much too slow. Now, to finish out, I'm going to be talking about a simulation that we did to see the impact of the COVID school closures. So we looked at both younger children who are currently in grade 1 and also older children who are currently in grade 6. And we say, what would happen by the time they get to grade 9? So given a year of school closure. So if there had been no school closures, 78% of the children would have foundational reading skills by the time they get to grade 9. But due to the 1 year of school closures, only 51% of the children who are currently in grade 1 would have foundational reading skills by the time they get to grade 9. And then we found for the older children, those in grade 6, the gap or the learning loss wouldn't be as significant. It would only drop from 78% to 71%, but there would still be a drop. So then we looked at different scenarios. So if there were a year of remediation following the school closures, then we see that some of the learning loss would be recouped. For the young children, for those in grade 1, rather than 51% of them having foundational reading skills by the time they get to grade 9, this would increase to 55%, so a modest increase. And then also a modest increase for those who are in the grade 6 cohort. But we found that the biggest difference would occur if there were a long-term approach, a system reorientation approach, something akin to like teaching at the right level or adjusting learning over the long term to allow children more time to recoup all of their lost learning from the year of school closures. And in these instances, we found that if this approach is used, then by the time the children in grade 1 got to grade 9, 75% of them would have foundational reading skills. So that's almost back to the 78% that would have had it if there had been no school closures to begin with. And then for those in grade 6, they're back to 78%. So it would be as if they had not lost 75% of their learning skills. So this any learning at all due to the 1 year of school closures. So this final graph is just kind of another way to look at what I just described, where, showing the trajectory from grade 1 to grade 9, that by the time they get to grade 9, if, the top one is 78% if there had been no school closures, and then at 75% would have foundational reading skills if they employ the system reorientation approach, and 55% would have foundational reading skills if there was just 1 year of remediation. And then if nothing at all is done to recoup lost learning, then only 51% of children by grade 9 would have foundational reading skills. So I'm going to stop there. Thank you very much. And I think we're going to now turn it over to Sakshi, and then we'll have a time for question and answer following her presentation. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Peggy. Good morning, everyone. I'm here to talk about our report in pursuit of education for all in West and Central Africa. So why did we do this report? One thing that was important was making children with disabilities seen, counted, and included. In 2008, we had the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. In 2016 is when the child functioning module was developed in collaboration between UNICEF and Washington Group. And this is a key moment because this is what was included in MIC6 data that allows us to do the analysis that we're presenting. In this presentation, I'll talk about what the child functioning module is, how do we conceptualize disability, and also present results on education. In 2021, we had a global UNICEF report on children with disabilities. And this was very important because this was the first time that we could make global and regional estimates on children with disabilities. So this report is the first regional report on children with disabilities. We're also working with other regions, and it provides new evidence on designing inclusive education strategies for country offices, Ministry of Education, and regional offices. And it also serves as advocacy tool. So why did we start with West and Central Africa? Because when the report, the global report came out, the West and Central Africa region, which is the UNICEF West and Central Africa region, all the organizations have their own region. We're talking about the UNICEF West and Central Africa region, had the largest percentage of children with disability. So it was important to unpack that with the 15% of 0 to 17-year-olds with disabilities, what is happening in the countries that have data available? Are they able to access education? These were the sort of questions that we were looking to respond to. So this report uses qualitative data from UNICEF's strategic monitoring questions and UNESCO peer for all 24 countries in the region. In the next slide, you'll see what the countries are, and it uses quantitative data. So the quantitative part only focuses on 9 countries with MIC6 data. Of these 9 countries, 3 are from KIX Africa 19 hub, that's the Gambia, Ghana, and Sierra Leone, and 6 countries are from KIX Africa 21. So these were the 9 countries that all the quantitative analysis that I'll present is on. And these are not, they don't allow us to make any regional estimates. So all the pooled estimates just represent these countries. And other MIC6 modules such as foundational learning and education questions allowed us to shed light on education for children with disabilities. So what is happening in the 24 countries that we were analyzing? We saw that countries in the region are committed to protecting the right to education for children with disabilities. 13 countries have ratified both the CPRD and the optional protocol. 8 had ratified only the CPRD. 2 are signatories to the convention and optional protocol, and only Sao Tome and Principe has neither signed the CPRD or the optional protocol. So we saw that there is commitment in the region to protect the right of children with disabilities. But the issue is that lack of data inhibits a fuller understanding of the education journeys of children with disabilities. So of the 24 countries in the region, we also analyzed what sort of information do they collect using their MS data on children with disabilities.
we see that the majority collect some information on children with disabilities through their MS. However, of the countries that are collecting data, they use medical definition of disability. And in the next slide, we'll see the difference between the medical model and the social model. But this is to just give you an idea that medical model is what MS generally uses. And 8 countries do not collect data on children with disabilities through MS. So it's not universal, the data collection on education for children with disabilities. Now, what was important is that it's important to embrace a broader definition of disability to identify and remove barriers in education. And that is why we'll present the child functioning module. So without further ado, let's see, how do we conceptualize? In the medical model approach, you'll see this slide says that what the medical model says is that we will rehabilitate you so that you can overcome on your barrier. The emphasis is on diagnostic labels rather than individual strengths and needs. The medical model views disability as a deficit inherent in the individual, which requires treatment or cure. And this is in opposition to social model approach, which is the approach that the functional difficulty module, the child functioning module takes. It says that we will remove all barriers that prevent you from participating in society. So having a disability is not having a medical condition, being unable to see is not the issue. The problem is that we're unable to provide you glasses that help you see, that can help you overcome the barrier. So this is the difference. It's a big difference. And the child functioning module uses the social model approach. So just an example of this, the child functioning module aligns with the ICF. It conforms to the ICF definition of the psychosocial model. And this is an example. So what does it say? It focuses, a child has developed myopia and cannot see well, right? So the child is unable to see. But if there is an unaccommodating environment where glasses are not available to the child who has difficulty seeing distant objects, then the child is less likely to participate in education as a result of the unaccommodating environment. So the focus is on the present and extent of functional difficulties rather than on body structure and conditions. The focus is on the environment that the child is instead of what is happening. It's the disability is an impairment in body function. It could be a limitation in activity. It could be a restriction in participation. So this is just an example of what the disability is. In terms of what the domains are covered, for children under 5, there are about 8 domains covered. And for children aged 5 to 17, there are a wider set of 13 domains that are covered. And how do we assess? So, the questions, it's comprised of 2 questionnaires. For 2 to 4-year-olds, there are 16 questions. And for 5 to 17-year-olds, there are 24 questions. The questions are administered to the mother or primary caregiver of the child. And the questions are designed to identify difficulties according to a range of severity. So here you'll see 1 is no difficulty, 2 is some difficulty, 3 is a lot difficulty, and 4 is cannot do at all. So this is the degree of functional difficulty against which we ask questions, and each domain is assessed against this rating scale. For most domains, children are considered to have functional difficulties if their mothers or primary caregivers respond that they cannot do at all or have a lot of difficulty in the domain. But there are differences. For example, for signs of anxiety and depression among children aged 5 to 17, the question we ask is whether a child shows signs of anxiety or depression on a daily basis. Similarly, for difficulty controlling behavior for 2 to 4-year-olds, it's asked whether a child is asked in comparison to other children, how does the child behave? And children are considered to have functional difficulty if they have difficulty in at least one functional domain. And functional difficulties are part of the parity indicator SDG 4.5.1. So this is a very unique module that allows us to contribute to SDG 4.5.1, which so far household surveys have not been able to. Now let's show you the results. What are the results saying? That 1 in 5 children aged 5 to 17 has at least one functional difficulty. And we say, which means that we see that We're seeing the results for 2 to 4 year olds and 5 to 17 year olds both. And we're seeing that 2 in 25 children aged 2 to 4 have a functional difficulty, and almost 1 in 5 children aged 5 to 17 has a functional difficulty. As you see, there are also differences between countries. Among the KIX Africa 19 countries, we're seeing in Sierra Leone, 7% of 2 to 4 year olds have functional difficulty, and 23% of 5 to 17 year olds have functional difficulties. Whereas in the Gambia, it's 5% of 2 to 4 year olds and 10% of 5 to 17 year olds. So we say don't compare 2 to 4 and 5 to 17 year olds because, as I presented earlier, they show different functional domains, but we can compare between countries. So we can compare 2 to 4 year olds in Sierra Leone with 2 to 4 year olds in Ghana. And across the countries, many 5 to 17 year olds have signs of anxiety and depression. So you're seeing the differences for 5 to 17 year olds, right? We're seeing the variation. In the Gambia, we see it's 10%, whereas in Sierra Leone, it's 23%, in Chad, it's 29%, in Central African Republic, it's 31%. But when we go down and we see, okay, what are the functional difficulties that we're seeing over and over in more children? We see that signs of anxiety and signs of depression there are more children that show these functional difficulties, that show signs of these functional difficulties. There are fewer children that are showing hearing functional difficulty or seeing functional. Now, this is also, remember, this is because the way the questions are structured, right? A child has hearing functional difficulty if the child is unable to hear. So if the child does have something that allows them to hear, then they won't be counted as having hearing functional difficulty. So it's based on the environment that the child. Therefore, when we see hearing and seeing, we're seeing the ones that are physically manifested functional difficulties that as an environment we're able to address more easily. But in terms of education, what do we see that's happening in the countries analyzed? We're seeing that children with disabilities are less likely to attend early childhood education among 3 to 4 year olds. And we're seeing among the KIX Africa 19 countries, Ghana and Sierra Leone show little difference, but the difference in the Gambia is high and statistically significant. Moving on, we look at children aged 5 to 17, and we see what is their current school attendance. So we're not looking at which level of education are they attending. And we're seeing that if you see on the leftmost side, we're seeing that children with any or multiple functional difficulties are less likely to be in school than children without functional difficulties. So it's high, we would have thought many children are not attending school, but we're seeing that, okay, 67% of children with any functional difficulties are attending school. But there are also big differences within by functional domains, right? You see 74% of children with seeing functional difficulty are attending school. But let's go on the rightmost. We're seeing 52% of children with self-care and 45% of children with communication difficulty are not currently attending school. Now, there are many reasons to explain why this is happening. And one reason is that first I said that we're looking at any level that they're attending. So children with self-care and communication are being left behind. They're not attending school, and it's a reason more than children with seeing or controlling behavior. So this is something that we hope to unpack more and understand why is this happening. We also look at whether children are attending the right level. So we look at children of primary age, and we see whether they're attending the primary level or a higher level of education. And we see systematically that children with any or multiple functional difficulties have a higher share of children not attending the right level or higher level of education. And again, you'll see that children with communication difficulty and children with self-care, these are the most disadvantaged at the primary level, but communication particularly so. And then at the lower secondary level is when we see we see a drastic change. Attendance declines across all groups at the lower secondary level, but the decrease is drastic for children with disabilities, and particularly so by functional domains. It's severe for children with self-care difficulty and children with learning difficulty. And so what we're seeing is that some children are being left behind more than the others. So perhaps children with self-care and children with learning disability are able to access primary education, but not so at lower secondary. So we're seeing a transition issue. So we start and see an access issue, then we also highlight a transition issue through our research. And the regression analysis further helps us highlight the disadvantage faced by children with learning difficulties. And why do I say that? So if you look at the chart on the left, right, you'll see that that at the primary level across the 9 countries analyzed, children with communication difficulties are less likely to be attending school at the right level than the peers with other difficulty, right? And learning is after it's anxiety and then it's learning. So there's a 5 percentage point less likelihood of you attending primary or a higher level of education if you have learning functional difficulty. But if you go to lower secondary, this 5% increases to a 12% decrease in likelihood. So at the lower secondary level, learning difficulty is associated with the greatest decrease in likelihood of attending school at the right level. So we're understanding that at the primary level, learning difficulty might not have that much of a disadvantage, but at the lower secondary level, it does. And we also look at functional at the foundational skills that Peggy presented in her presentation. And we see that children with functional difficulties are not acquiring skills at par with their peers. And here you see all the 3 countries, Ghana, Sierra Leone, and the Gambia, all 3 which are as part of KIX Africa 19, have children where are countries where children with functional difficulties are less likely to have foundational reading skills, and the differences are statistically significant. So what do we recommend? We recommend, first of all, that there should be targeted finance for children with disabilities, inclusive budgeting to incorporate disability inclusion considerations in the mainstream environment. We also say let's build a more inclusive data collection system by encouraging qualitative research, investing in more harmonized data system, and adding a diversity dimension. We also make a point that we should enhance the capacity for inclusive education sector analysis and strategic planning. And lastly, we say let's build cross-sectoral partnerships to provide holistic support and safeguarding the rights of children, the right to education for children with disabilities. I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sakshi, and thank you, Peggy, before for these really insightful presentations and striking findings that you've shared with us. Now we'd like to open it up to all the participants to raise any questions that you have about these findings and or share sort of reflections from your country about how this applies. And please feel free to turn on your video if you feel comfortable. Yes, and you can raise your hand or just unmute and ask your questions. I think we have some participants from some of the countries that were represented in these findings. So if you have any comments or sort of reflections to share. Yes,
hello.
Welcome. Keba?
Yeah, thank you very much. I think the finding is very, very interesting. And so far what I've seen is actually that there is a need for a collaborative effort, especially in terms of trying to look at the right funding to also include the needs of children with disability. This is indeed very apt. The finding is very informative, and I think this will help us also as we look forward to looking for more funding from the Global Partnership for Education and trying to look at catering the needs of children with disability in our coming projects. By the way, I am representing a civil society organization, but I'm a member of the LEG. And of course, I'm also engaged and involved in trying to plan ahead for the education sector. So I think this is very, very important. Yeah, definitely. I am definitely been, it's very insightful for me, and I think it's helpful. Over.
Thank you so much, Keba, who's coming from the Gambia. Any other reflections or questions from other participants?
Good afternoon. Yeah.
Good afternoon.
This is John from Sierra Leone. Yeah, so we thank you for this presentation and the findings, and they are well in place. But what I would really recommend that we need more capacity, and also build the capacity and also infrastructure more when it comes to infrastructure, because most of these difficulties are based on the surrounding. For example, there are places of learning places that are not disabled friendly, and even the teachers, some of the teachers also, they don't have knowledge in how to manage disabled. You know, we don't have trained teachers that have special needs. We have, the number is very small. We don't even have, for Sierra Leone, it's very difficult to find some of them, even though the is very small, the number that are able to attend. And most of these schools, they are a mixed school, and the teachers are they only look at the able children that are able, not, but they fail to understand that even that in the classroom, there are other students that are not really, that is why you see even they're learning, because some of them, you cannot see their disability physically until you come close to them. And because of the classroom, maybe some school, they have over 100 people in class or 50 in class. So you find difficult to able to identify those people. So I think it also depends on infrastructure and more capacity building of teachers, and how they can able to really identify those kind of people having those communication, be it hearing impairment, so that they can able to cater for all of them. Because some of them, the sooner they go to school, if they're not being catered for, they will just go out and leave school because they thought they are not being counted by this teacher. So I think these kind of reports will be shared with all stakeholders, and to see the need how to able to improve the life of the people, children with disability. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, John, for those insights. Any reactions, or maybe if there's any other representatives from other countries who've done sort of work on these issues and maybe have some best practices to share or ideas? Feel free to come in. Vicky?
Yes, I would like to ask a little bit in context of what John said and of what I gathered from your presentations. I would like to ask your opinion about education for children with disabilities, for example, such as hearing, the deaf, hard of hearing, or the blind in resource scarce environments such as Western Africa, for example, some Western African countries, for example. Do you advocate only and exclusively for inclusive educational environments, or for special schools as well? By special schools, I mean schools for the deaf, schools for the blind, for example.
Sakshi, do you want to take this question?
Yeah, I will say I can't speak on behalf of UNICEF because it is very big, but UNICEF does advocate for inclusive education environments. And though from personal experience, I would say that in terms of extreme functional difficulties, when children do face extreme difficulties, I do see some value in special schools. But I do want to share a case, you know, in Thailand. Thailand was identifying a number of children with disabilities, and they were putting them in special schools. When they did an analysis, they realized, in fact, what is happening is that a lot of children don't speak the language that they were assessing them in. So they were counting those children as children with disabilities, whereas the simple issue was that children were not speaking the language that they were assessing in. So it's also a question of screening tool. It's a question of how are we approaching it? But as UNICEF does say that inclusive environments are the best for children, and it is on us to adapt universal design for learning to achieve that. Thank you.
Thank you, Sakshi, and thank you for the question, Vicky. Any other questions folks want to raise or experiences they want to share with one another? Maybe one question from my side while folks are thinking. Sakshi, you mentioned that not many countries have data available on children with disabilities, especially this sort of social model. How can they go about addressing that?
I see there was a question from Festus. I can respond, and then maybe Festus can jump in. So the child functional module can be added to any household survey. There is the LSMS survey, the DHS. If the country has its own national survey, it can add the child functioning module, which is what Susainas does. So, you know, it's about advocating with the country to say that this is important data that we need to analyze, you know, and if it is through household survey and depend on what the household survey data collects, you could not only education analysis, but you can look at their participation in labor market and, you know, and so on and so forth. So really it's about advocating that there is a need to collect this kind of data. Thank you. Festus, please go ahead.
Thank you, Sakshi. Festus, did you want to come in with a question or a comment?
No, not really, not really. I went off, so I decided to come in again. That was why my phone was mute.
Wonderful. Well, if there's no immediate questions now, maybe we can also have go back to the first presentation from Peggy, which highlighted really low learning levels. As well as differences in learning based on equity dimensions, as well as the impact of COVID on learning, and then the potential for remedial programs to help sort of address that learning loss. Do any countries here or any representatives here want to share any experiences that they have in addressing these learning losses and how that has been going?
Yeah, I'm just interested in the experiences if countries are seeing that children are returning to school in the same numbers as they did prior to the school closures, or if you're seeing a drop in attendance, children not returning to school. And also if there have been any, you know, special measures put in place to address the learning loss. So if any of you have any experiences that you could share along those lines, I'd love to hear it.
Okay.
Yes. Okay.
All right. Okay, let me come in. I think let me first share my appreciation to the Ministry of Basic and Secondary Education, which is MOPSI in the Gambia, for actually designing several models of trying to recover learning losses. Having realized that learning at the right level or schooling at the right level have an impact, and then the on the outcome of the learner in his or her achievements. And we have seen that during the COVID, schools were closed, but as soon as schools were closed, there were interventions like distant learning through the radio programs. And the ministry did not stop at that. Also, there was a lot of engagement and consultation where we at the other side of the divide, the civil society, we participated, and then we showed our concern for learners, that especially those that are disabled, and then they're also part of the upper regions, that access to radio programs would be a challenge to them. After that intervention, we have seen the response from the communities, where the communities that could not even afford to get even battery cells for, radios because of the level of poverty. So many interventions came in, and then the ministry also used approaches where they have extra hours studies being allocated, although they were short, and looking also at the learners level. Maybe grade 3, grade 2 children would have been very young to stay in school, and then also school meal service also, because COVID is actually reducing contact. So people were definitely losing a lot in terms of the learning, but ministry came up with strategies and extra tuition, and actually answer your question, learning recovered, and then, so far children are all going to school, and actually even the holidays period, which is the break after although COVID is still here, but the restrictions are lifted, learners are back on, and then I think learning is going on very well in the Gambia. Actually, I cannot give you any data as to how many percent recovery was able to be done, because there was no data collection on that number of hours. Thank you. Over.
Thank you very much for sharing your experience in the Gambia. Any other experiences anyone would like to share?
Yes. Thank you very much for this. For Sierra Leone, after the COVID, in fact, during the COVID, when schools were closed, we had a radio teaching programs, though the radios will not reach all the areas because of Sierra Leone. Look at the geography, not every community could be able to get the national radio. So what happened? The education radio have to connect other local radios to AM teaching, even while the children are at home. And the government also tried to provide kids with radio. Those who cannot afford radios were given, and more especially those in the remote areas were given. And also those in the city, they have the television. The thing also was via television also, where they can teach lessons based on their different levels. So that was also done to keep them. In fact, it was hard based on time. There was a timetable for every level, which they were able to follow up on that teaching, and that one was very, very interesting. Now I can able to give you the data, though there was a data for that, but I cannot tell you now because of I don't have it with me. I don't want to give you wrong data, but at the end of the day, it was somehow successful. And after the COVID lockdowns were lifted up, and the attendance was encouraging. In fact, by then it was close to examination. So those examination students, all of them also came back and attend. Though few of them could not because of certain problems, some because of getting pregnant, more the girls, and that was also a somehow challenge. But in general, it did some kind of things. People were able to, children were able to learn some skills, learn some things about the areas, and that was able to help them. Though there were challenges, like because most areas, by the time the radio is off, maybe there is no light, or maybe sometimes the time the radio is on, those children are staying at home will be sent by their parents to go and do something. Some will be going to the market to sell, some will be playing, and some don't even have educated parents who can be able to inform them that this is the time to go for the lessons. But in general, it was better. And at the end of that, COVID-19 restrictions and the outcome of that, lots of people also come back to school. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Yeah, it's been interesting to hear from both of you about the different forms of remote learning strategies that were put in place during the school closures, and also to hear that children are coming back to school. So, well, thank you very much.
Thank you, John, and thank you, Peggy. Zamzam, do you want to come in and say a few words about the evaluation as we wrap up our session?
Sure. And colleagues can quickly, even if they need to just put in some inputs, they're more than welcome to. I've put into the chat box a link to our evaluation survey. I'm asking if you can fill out the survey, which really just supports us to understand how these events are going. It takes about 4 minutes to fill it out, very short questionnaire. What is to happen next is you will receive the recording of this webinar, also a brief, short interactive brief that covers all the topics. But please make sure to fill out the survey, which just takes a few minutes of your time, but really supports us to follow up with you on how these webinar meetings are going and learning events are going. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Zamzam. And unfortunately, our time is up. I want to thank everyone for joining us today. A special thank you to Peggy and Sakshi for presenting these really interesting findings and hopefully sparking some reflection and discussion with your colleagues. And thank you to Zamzam and the KIX Africa 19 Hub for organizing. And we look forward to seeing everyone at a future learning event. All right. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.